Hello everyone, and welcome back to another instalment of our long-running webinar series. Since we started our webinars in 2017, hundreds of experts have shared their knowledge on many different sustainability topics. Hearing from our experts and experienced guest speakers is a great way to build your sustainability knowledge and help your business succeed sustainably. As nature-related issues make their way into policies and regulations, your business needs to understand how to account for nature. Join our Senior Sustainability Specialist, Rosie Dodd, and our Head of Strategy and Disclosures, Martin Fryer, to learn how to get started with nature-related disclosures and where they fit in with existing frameworks. Let's get into it.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another installment of our webinar series. It's my pleasure to hand it over to Martin. Martin will give us a bit of an overview of what all this alphabet soup is all about, the different reporting frameworks and how do they relate together and how to choose the right one. So over to you, Martin.
Kia ora Barbara, kia ora katoa, everyone. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the webinar. I'm Head of Strategy and Disclosures, so sustainability disclosures have been a huge part of my career, and at ThinkStep I'm working with a broad cross-section of clients across different sectors and all kind of using different reporting frameworks to communicate their sustainability performance, their sustainability strategies. So I just thought I'd start with a bit of a roundup of what's happening around sustainability disclosures at a global level. So as Barbara said, it wasn't too long ago, webinars used to talk about the alphabet soup of sustainability reporting. Are you going to do a GRI report? Is it going to be an integrated report? Do you have to respond to DJSI? Are you responding to CDP? And it was all getting a very kind of confused landscape. So what we've actually seen in the last 18 months, 2 years, thankfully, is some consolidation at a global level. So the International Financial Reporting Standards, IFRS, set up the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB, to try and coordinate and produce one global standard for sustainability disclosures. And they've actually produced two, because they've also produced a standard around climate-related disclosures. And there are obviously some differences and alignments between those standards. But what they've been keen to ensure is the interoperability, and as exponents of plain English, we hate that word, but interoperability between the different standards, which basically means if you are producing an integrated report, if you're looking at the 6 capitals, human, financial, manufactured, social, intellectual, and natural, then your disclosures will be aligned with the requirements of the ISSB. What's interesting is obviously the different standards and frameworks use slightly different language, and what we've experienced here in New Zealand, with it being the first kind of jurisdiction to regulate climate related financial disclosures, is that obviously the language there in terms of regulation and guidance adds potentially another layer of complexity. So when you look at the language in those different frameworks, the ISSB actually referred to biodiversity rather than nature. The European Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive also kind of refers to biodiversity and the creation of transition plans and targets and policies and implementation. And GRI have produced their own standard around biodiversity disclosures at the beginning of this year. So we're watching that very, very closely, because if we think back around the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that was set up in 2015 to look at this disclosure around climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And it's taken almost 10 years for that to get regulated. And I don't think that we can actually wait that long when we're starting to look at nature-related financial disclosures, because of that they are inextricably linked, and the frameworks for disclosure are there, and the question is, what does it actually look like for nature-related disclosures? So that's a very brief introduction. I'm now going to hand over to Rosie, who will go into a little bit more detail.
Thanks so much, Martin. I'll just briefly come in here to introduce Rosie. Rosie has joined us in February, but we've known Rosie for a really long time because we used to work for the same company when Rosie was still with ThinkStep back in Europe. She's joined us now, coming from the UK, coming from the Carbon Trust. And we're very excited to have her here because Rosie brings with her also some experience in doing looking at some of the early implementations and checking on what do you need to do to get ready on nature-related disclosures. So we'd just really love to hear from you, Rosie, on why would companies want to think about nature disclosures and how does it relate to carbon disclosures?
Thanks, Barbara. Let's have a little look, shall we? So many companies have been on board with climate-related disclosures for a good while now, and may have already been thinking about nature in some capacity through their typical enterprise risk management systems too. This is especially true for organizations in really high-profile sectors such as palm oil or mining, who perhaps through reputational and legislative pressures have been reporting their operations, sustainable developments, grievance procedures with local communities, things like that for a number of years already. Now, making disclosures of climate-related risks and opportunities has shown to have really great financial and climate impacts for companies by helping them to increase their brand value, build confidence with investors, and improve their strategic resilience. And in contrast, failing to disclose indicates a greater vulnerability to climate and nature change, reduced confidence from investors because there's just less information to go on, and reducing business value because supply chains might be way more open to random events from changes in climate and nature. And the consequence of this is the financial community prices those related risks, that damage, instability, into decision making, and that can inflate the cost of capital. Inflated capital costs means financial barriers to then mitigating and adapting to those risks from climate change, or as we'll see, nature change too. So we can recognize the power of making disclosures and the benefits of all the work behind them, but we don't want to stop with climate. It's now time to think about nature too. So we're about to get quite acronym heavy. Sorry for that. Thankfully, Martin's already introduced these lightly already. Climate and nature risk are not two sides of the same coin. They are far more interconnected than that. Climate risk drives impacts on nature and is similarly accelerated by those impacts as well. Like the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, is a market-led, government-supported, and science-based initiative with a private sector task force group of global financial institutions and companies across a range of different sectors and market intermediaries as well. The TNFD is not a standard setter. They want to be incorporated into existing regulatory standards, just like the TCFD was folded into the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And it all gets quite tiring after a while. So the TNFD is already integrated into the Global Reporting Initiative, into the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe, and they are already working with the CDP as well to ensure they include their TNFD disclosures. And the hopeful future for the TNFD is for it to join the TCFD into the International Sustainability Standards Board as well. And the fact that the TCFD is already integrated there is basically great, mission accomplished. That's where we want to end up. As a global community, back in 2022, we agreed to do something about the dangerous decline in nature observed during the United Nations Biodiversity Conference in Montreal in Canada. Here is where we set an agreement that was adopted and called the Coming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or GBF. This framework set 4 main goals that we should try to achieve by 2050, in addition to our net zero ambitions. There are a number of targets underneath this, but the 4 main goals are to halt human-induced species extinction, to ensure the sustainable use of biodiversity, to ensure the equitable sharing of benefits, and to close the biodiversity finance gap, which is currently at $700 billion per year. And 2023 as a year was pretty big for nature in general, especially for Europe with the publication of new nature restoration laws, deforestation laws. But what we're interested in today are the recommendations of the TNFD published in September of last year. And this really marked a new era for finance and business and nature for capital markets, policy markets, the private sector, who are more and more aware of the potential for stranded assets related to nature changes, and for there to be winners and losers as well. And we also need to work out a bit more how to blend that science data with finance data so we can really understand what we're looking at and need to achieve here.
So Rosie, a quick question here. Does it mean if we talk a lot about biodiversity that the nature-related disclosures, and if we think about nature, this really is just about our living environment? Or is there more to it?
Yeah, right. There's definitely more to it than that. And on a really simple level, the way I've had this described previously is nature is not just biodiversity, it's living things and it's dead stuff as well. And it's easiest potentially to think about this from our starting block that we've already been talking about, which is climate. So we've been talking about climate for a while because ultimately of the ways its changes impact people and economies too. But then when you open that umbrella of climate change, what we're really interested in are the ways it's impacting our access to resources, the stability of those resources, other things that impact our activities. And what this translates to is how climate change impacts our natural world. So nature is, and it always has been, the big deal here. We've just not thought about it in that systemic fashion before. And within nature, we have all our dead stuff, metals, fuels, land, space, and then we have all our living things, and that is our biodiversity. And guaranteed most companies have been thinking about this for a long while already. It's just not been pulled out to meaningful disclosures yet. And you're right, Barbara, nature-related risks aren't just for the food sector, for example. They're for everyone. They're for pharmaceuticals, construction companies, mining companies too, because even in the acquisition of minerals, dead stuff, usually depends on the state of the living nature around those activities to guarantee its success. So nature boils down to land, ocean, freshwater, and atmosphere. Now, natural capital are the stocks of nature-related assets, things like food, water that we depend upon. And those assets give rise to flows of benefits towards people in the economy, which in geek speak is called ecosystem services. And these are things like crop pollination, water purification, and they support our economic activities, which might be forestry, fisheries, tourism, culture, energy generation. And the value of those services currently is estimated to be more than $140 trillion by the OECD. And biodiversity comes in because biodiversity is what enables those ecosystem services to be delivered by nature in a productive, resilient way that we can depend upon. A decline in biodiversity has the absolute opposite effect and disables our ecosystem services. So it's actually quite a serious thing to look at.
Got a quick question in here because you called this, have you ever heard of natural capital? Martin, at the very beginning, you've mentioned briefly the capitals of the integrated reporting framework. Is that where this connection is? Is this what the capital of our natural environment refers to in the integrated reporting framework?
It does, Barbara. Yes, that wording of natural capital and the integrated reporting framework, it really forces organizations to look at the flow of that capital through their organization. So they need to view nature and the flow of nature through their organization, the outputs that it enables them to create, but also the outcomes that they want to achieve in relation to their impacts on the natural environment. So that is, without doubt, natural capital is part and parcel of integrated reporting, yes.
Does it mean if I'm already well into integrated reporting, it means I am looking at the natural capital as part of that I'm already partway there to get my head around nature-related financial disclosures?
Absolutely. The fundamental concept around integrated reporting is looking at value creation and value destruction, and as organizations embrace those sort of concepts, it allows them to embrace that idea of their impact on, yes, nature, but also their dependence on nature in terms of operating as an organization. So if you are using integrated reporting, you are already thinking along the same lines. Whether you need to do more is really a question for Rosie in terms of what do the disclosures actually require of organizations.
Thanks. That's, I think, really important to be aware of that link, and that you're not actually starting with a blank sheet when you think about your nature-related financial disclosures if you're already doing integrated reporting. Rosie, back to you.
Great, next slide. Yeah, I mean, the good news is, right, most companies are not starting from scratch here. Most nature-related evaluations are already built into existing thinking. They've just not been pulled out before, perhaps because previously there wasn't that explicit expectation from investors and banks that companies would be reporting their identified nature risks and dependencies, which there is now a growing need for. And nature-related risks are already in reality in the cash flows and balance sheets of businesses and in the capital allocation portfolios of financial institutions as well. So a company making plant-based milk using almonds sourced from California, which is where 80% of the world's almonds are cultivated, probably already knows that they depend on strong pollination services because almond trees can only be pollinated by bees, and that biodiversity loss and climate change is really impacting bee populations. In fact, they probably already calculated that when 32% of bee colonies were lost in 2021 in that area, it was exceptionally difficult to obtain pollination services, and that placed an incredible risk on their business by increasing operational costs related to that pollination service enormously. It was up to 20% of total cost of operations in that year for those growing almonds. And that line of thinking all needs to be pulled together and the financial impact then disclosing. The early adopters who already piloted the TNFD found that the TCFD does provide good building blocks to retrofit existing work for this framework as well. And this logic of thinking is defined by the TNFD in 4 critical steps. 1, locate your interface with nature. And part of this means needing to identify what's material to your institution based on where your footprint is, what your relationships with nature are, and what is highest on your priority list. And what should sit on your list is not predefined by the TNFD. That's up to you. That might be based on procurement spend of specific resources, or it might be revenue generation from key environmental assets. 2 is then evaluating your impacts and dependencies, i.e. where and what's happening to your bees. And 3, evaluating and assessing your risks and opportunities, which is something we're already familiar with. And then finally, preparing to respond and report. And the TNFD calls this the LEAP approach. You don't need to use this. It's just a tool and it's there to help you think. And that's the logic of thinking. Next slide, please. So there was some geek speak in there. I apologize for that. First of all, locating your interface with nature. Those aren't my words. They're straight from the horse's mouth. And the word interface is quite different to impacts, isn't it? So that's because it's not just about the forces that we exert on the planet anymore, but rather about looking into our interactions with nature as a two-way relationship. And that looks really different depending on where you are in your activities. I also mentioned materiality, deciding what's most important to you. As I said, the TNFD doesn't describe what this is for you. You can just look at dependencies, things you depend upon, single materiality, or impacts as well, double materiality. And in reality, we depend a lot on nature. And so we really need to be accounting for that in our assessments. And the TNFD really strongly recommends double materiality for that reason, because it's not a black and white line between impacts and dependencies. We shouldn't really be thinking about them in isolation. And as an example, almond farmers have a dependency on bees, right? They nurture commercial honeybee hives. If those bees outcompete other species, which reduces biodiversity, it undermines the ecosystem all bees need to thrive. The consequence of that is that on average, 30% of bee populations are lost each year, and that places greater stress on the demand for pollination services, which creates a new driver to try and expand commercial honeybee cultivation to address the immediate problem. And nature impacts also create new dependencies in your business as well, which is important to be aware of. So if you're a farmer using fertilizer, and that fertilizer gradually degrades your soils, you will over time increasingly need to use more fertilizer to compensate for that soil degradation. The financial risk there, for example, might be how it opens you up to the risk of increased costs of fertilizers over time, or legislative changes in terms of what chemicals you can use. All right, next slide, please. So hopefully now you feel we've set the scene a bit. Barbara, what do you think?
I think that was a really, really good summary to get us all thinking of what are these interconnections between nature and climate change, and the need that we really need to balance our use and reliance of resources in the transition to net zero as well. So it's not just we're looking at nature for nature's sake, but we actually do depend on nature as well to reduce our to achieve our net zero goal. It obviously needs to be a balance that is equitable and fair and can't leave anyone behind. And the other thing that I think I'm on the wrong slide here. Sorry, I'm summarizing the next bit. So we've got our global commitment that we're working towards, the GBF, the Global Biodiversity Framework. Nature already is on the balance sheet. And for those who do integrated reporting, are already well underway to do that. And the difference really is that nature issues are very specific to location. Where carbon is a global topic, nature will be very different to local issues on biodiversity. I really like the LEAP acronym of locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare, which really is your guidance on how to get started. So my question then is, the bees and the mining examples are quite clear to me, but the water and the Hinterkirch that you've had on your slide seems to be also a climate change issue. So how do they really interact?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a really clear nexus between climate and nature, and climate change remains just as important. The fact that we've whizzed well past the 1.5 degree warming goal looms over everything, but nature actually plays a really big part in our response to climate change. Now, where it gets tricky is balancing the use of nature between our climate change response, the resources we consume, and then restoring and conserving nature as well. So let's zoom in on land as one quick example. At the moment, 3.2 billion people are affected by land degradation around the world, and global hunger is also very high. But at the same time, food systems are estimated to be responsible for up to 1/3 of our annual global emissions. And then to offset the impacts of climate change, we want to pursue land-hungry decarbonisation solutions like solar panel farms or afforestation. Sometimes inspired the global hunger, we even burn crops for biofuel. And it's a really delicate balance to get right, which is why we need an integrated strategy that manages climate and nature. And when we look at nature, it needs to be locally specific, have a greater focus on the value chain, and include people in decision-making in order for it to be equitable. And companies can approach it in exactly the same way. Next slide, please. Water is exactly the same, and it's a good way to demonstrate that nature issues aren't just for organizations dealing with the living stuff, but like tech companies, energy providers are more aware of their reliance on water as well. Quick example, our clean energy transition is gradually building up the hydrogen market. And water is a key ingredient in producing green hydrogen. But you can't just stick a big straw into an aquifer and drink up all the water for green hydrogen, because other people and ecosystems depend on that resource as well. Next slide, please. So there's a clear nexus between nature and climate, but we can't measure nature risks the same way as we measure climate risks. And that's simply because there isn't a single fungible unit like carbon dioxide equivalence that doesn't really care where you are in the world. Climate risks are just measured using greenhouse gas emissions, regardless. And risks from weather-related events, for example, might pop up, but their likelihood is ultimately always evaluated through an emissions lens. Nature accounting is similar, but depending on your company, your sector, and where you are, your metrics are going to look a little different. The almond farmers might be looking at bee populations, or the apple farms at disease, the mine at rainfall patterns. The TNFD have provided a set of core global metrics, and more recently, sector-specific guidance for companies to follow. And you'll probably find a lot of these are pretty familiar to you already, like plastic pollution, spatial footprint, hazardous waste management. Others will be potentially new for you.
Big thank you, Rosie. That I think was really clear that there is that interconnection between nature and climate change, but also that we have to balance our resource use to get to net zero. We obviously need a fair transition, And I think it'll be a lot more complex from what you just said, because exactly of this, going back to the last slide, because it's just not one measure. It is more complex to really measure impact of nature, and it has so many dimensions to it. But that makes it even more important to get started. If we think about the TCFD, that was the first recommendations were published about 10 years ago, and only very recently made it into legislation in Australia and here now. I just cannot wait for another 10 years for that same thing to happen for nature. So, Rosie, what do you expect? What's coming next?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's take a look at the next slide. We've already touched on this. We know where the TCFD is now sitting in legislation for Aotearoa New Zealand and coming to Australia as well. The TNFD is going to follow suit, but we've got quite a few years before the gavel drops. And that's, I think, really great, because it means that right now, companies have got a few years to start preparing and responding to these recommendations, and just building the way along the learning curve that this is, looking at different concepts, new data, internal capacities, before it becomes mandatory as well. But whilst it is currently a voluntary mechanism, it is likely to eventually end up with the ISSB too. So if you want to achieve that North Star, key thing is to just really start now. There is a learning curve. It won't hurt to give yourself time to climb that curve. A good starting block is to really reflect on what you already know and what you don't know. Many companies don't even know where all their direct activities occur, let alone suppliers way down the value chain. But quite a few of the pilots and early adopters of the TNFD have found pretty good alignment with their governance through previous work that they've completed, such as TCFDs. So key recommendations here are to review what peers have found or are already doing, and maybe complete a gap analysis yourself of what you've already done, your existing work, to identify any alignments you already have with the TNFD. So for example, if you're already reporting on environmental risks, perhaps you just actually need to adopt the TNFD classifications, physical, transition, or systemic risk categories. If you've already got descriptions of your governance and board level management responsibilities for nature, then maybe you just need to pull that out and refine it with the right terminology. If you've already got commitments to biodiversity, land use, atmosphere, and nature, you can just look at perhaps setting more committing targets with KPIs. The TNFD does introduce new concepts, notably the need to locate your interface and think about your materiality. So for this, we recommend to complete a mapping exercise to understand your value chain, your related sensitivities, your related risks, what's going on there. And then once you've done that, prioritize your environmental assets and activities to define what's material for your organization. And once you've done that, you can then explore ways you can start demonstrating a commitment to align with the global biodiversity framework. And after that, investigate how you can then adopt a climate nature model so that your strategy works for your decarbonization targets and your nature targets at the same time. You can start defining those goals now, even if they're just existing ones, and use that information to define metrics, start putting that rubber on the road. And it's just a starting point, right? A good metric is one you can collect data for, track, and relate to achievable smart targets.
Thank you so much, Rosie. And Martin, that was a whirlwind tour through what nature-related financial disclosures are all about. We have time for one or two quick questions, and I might kick it off with, from your experience, Rosie, what has been the greatest challenge for adoption that has been flagged so far?
Good question. So there's two parts to this. One is the perceived complexity of the TNFD. The TNFD is a TCFD with nature context built into it. So the perception is that, yes, we're throwing a lot of metrics around, we're throwing a lot of new terminology around. You've already done more than you think. Maybe you just need a bit of help working out what that is, what that looks like, and how to build on from it. But that's the number one thing. Number two is the nature data, the horsepower internally and the internal capacity to understand and interpret the nature data that's being collected. We've got decades of years worth of nature data, but drilling that down and putting it into the context of your business is one of the biggest barriers for sure.
So basically what you're saying is hardly anyone would start with a blank piece of paper. We just need to identify what is it that you have done and to align it to the requirements and recommendations of the TNFD. I think that's a really, really useful piece of advice. Have a final one for you, Rosie. Are there any sectors that are leading the way that we can learn from?
Yeah, so Australia's actually had a really strong start already with representation from financial institutions, consumer goods, services, energy, and the transport sectors as well. We are still waiting for uptake from sort of agricultural companies, mining and resource extraction sectors to join in as well. And we're a little bit slower on the side in New Zealand too, but it'll be interesting to see how that develops over time.
Thanks again, Rosie. Thanks, Martin. And we're very much looking forward to seeing you all again next time. Have a wonderful afternoon.
We have many more webinars on our website on a whole host of sustainability topics.